So this is Frank Mulcahy. Thank you very much for coming in today for the Village podcast, Frank. I'm going to synopsize this in a couple of ways, but the first is pretty brutal. The story here, Frank's story, is that the state, led by Micheál Martin, lied over 25 years and in effect destroyed his life. And the details of that are that, well, the nub of it is that Micheál Martin, current Taoiseach, said he'd correct all statements he'd made implicating Frank years ago in fraud, after the EU showed that far from committing the alleged fraud, that Frank had in fact been set up by Micheál Martin's department, the Department of Enterprise. But Martin in the end didn't correct those Dáil statements because firstly he wanted to protect a party colleague who's now a county councillor who'd been central to the making of those allegations against Frank. And secondly, that Micheál Martin and his department wanted to protect the Exchequer from the maladministration claim. And in the end, the state instigated an inquiry to investigate the whole issue, and that reported recently, but because the terms of reference fell very far short, it didn't advance the state of knowledge to any significant extent. It's a huge story with multiple tangents. I'm particularly keen. It's one of my biggest frustrations. One of the stories that we have that's the biggest that we haven't managed to get much public traction for, and I'm sure it's very frustrating. I know it's been very frustrating for Frank, dating back 25 years. So it's a tale of government of our time that says so much about the way government operates, and says a lot about the way the department interrelates with the politicians, and also there's an EU angle on it. So the story is how government destroyed an individual over 25 years, indeed continues to. So I'm just going to start by asking you, Frank, just tell us a little bit about your background, I suppose, including where you were at the start of this 25 years ago.
Well, I was the chief executive and founding director of the Irish Small and Medium Enterprises Association. We founded that after the four associated banks had failed in their endeavour to censor my criticisms of them. ISME, the association that I was associated with, was phenomenally successful in terms of its financial revenue, but also politically, to such an extent that in 1997, some 4 years after it was established, the government approached some of the directors of ISME to secure their cooperation with the social partnership process, which I opposed for a variety of reasons. And that is what initially led to the decision of the directors of ISME.
So there was hostility towards you because you were taking a view that other powerful people in the organisation didn't think was appropriate on social partnership, the business of the employers engaging in an official process, particularly over wages with the unions. So then ISME made allegations against you. What were they and who made them?
Well, first of all, they approached me and asked me to resign with faxed threats of accusing me of fraud if I didn't comply. At the same time, they offered me £100,000 as an inducement. I didn't think that people could accuse me of fraud successfully where no fraud had occurred.
And though in particular, a man called Seamus Butler.
Seamus Butler was appointed by the original founders of ISME as the director on the 7th of August 1998. And on the 12th of August 1998, he received a fax from the original directors telling him to get on side with my removal.
And then we exhibited in an article we published in the magazine threats where Mr. Butler threatened to ensure that you would never work again in this country and that he would make poor controls and management look like fraud.
These aren't just allegations. These were threats that were made in writing at the time, and yet, when brought to the attention of the guards, they were completely ignored.
But the allegations were primarily made by this man, Seamus Butler.
Yes.
And why would Seamus Butler have had it in for you, and where is he now?
Well, Seamus, there's no explanation as to why Butler decided to go along with the accusations, other than the fact that he was chairman and his position was threatened if he didn't.
Okay, so how did he implicate you in fraud?
He, out of the blue, after making several allegations over a period of 9 months, on the 5th of March, he unilaterally went to the guards in Harcourt Square and accused me of defrauding the European Commission. I had no prior knowledge of that. I learnt of that the next day.
Okay, so take us through what the substance of that was. What was the precise allegation about the alleged fraud and the European Union?
This is where it gets slightly complicated, but simply put, according to Mr. Butler, I had defrauded the EU of £12,375 by virtue of the fact that the associated invoices had been unpaid at the time that they were submitted for payment to the Department of Enterprise, Trade and
Okay, now you say that in fact the department was implicated in this having happened in the first place. It was something that effectively something you couldn't have avoided. Isn't that correct?
What I say is, first of all, there was no money missing.
Okay.
Second of all, the department had actually prepared the application for payments of the grant. So from the outset, the allegation made absolute no sense.
So you, as far as you were concerned, you were completely compliant with the departmental recommendations as to how this should be handled.
Since the department had prepared the application with the financial director of ISME, had approved the 3 unpaid invoices, there could be no.
Okay. So these allegations were forwarded to the DPP, isn't that correct? And can you tell me about the role of the Garda? What was the role of, in particular, Martin Callan, the former chief superintendent?
Well, at this stage, Martin Callan wasn't involved.
Okay.
At this stage, it was the fraud squad. The fraud squad were well aware that the allegations were contrived and vexatious because they had been provided with the documents and the evidence that there was no fraud.
What were those documents?
Those documents were internal ISME documents which showed that the accusation had been in the planning stage for some 2 years before they actually went to the fraud squad. And yet Mr. Butler was claiming that he had discovered it just some 2 months before he involved the Guard.
Okay, so tell us about the role of the Guards then.
Well, at this stage, our disposition was to trust the Guards implicitly and explicitly. I was confident that rather than reporting me to the DPP, because of the evidence, that Mr. Butler would be the one that was.
And what would he have been reported for setting you up?
For making vexatious and wasting Guards.
So how did the Guards do with each of those separately?
Well, they just ignored them. They reported me to the DPP. Well, by virtue of the Guards having made a report to the DPP, I was deemed to be somewhat culpable because that report by the Guards gave Mr. Butler's allegations some credence.
And what happened to the report?
The DPP didn't pursue the report. However, ISME decided that there was evidence of fraud on my part.
So they made the mistake of assuming that.
Didn't make a mistake. That was their intention.
That was their intention.
And not only that, when I went to the Guards and asked them to give me a letter stating that I was innocent of the charges, the Chief Superintendent, Austin McNally, stated that we didn't find you innocent, we just didn't get the evidence to prosecute.
But that's not the way the system works. You're innocent until proven guilty.
Well, that may be the way that should be the system, but in fact I was deemed to be culpable. I was dismissed and I was rendered up.
So tell me about the role of Martin Callan.
Well, Martin Callan didn't get involved until 2005, after I discovered that the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment had actually told the Guards in their original statement that there was no basis to the allegation. So having acquired those internal memos from the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, I asked to see Martin Callan. I presented him with that memo. He dismissed it.
So you should have been off the hook on the basis that the department that had been so central to the instigation of this thing against you in the first place was now saying that you'd done no wrong.
Correct.
And you'd have expected that the commissioner would have been supportive.
The year before I approached Mr. Callan, several questions had, in fact, on 5 separate dates in 2004, the issue had been raised in Dáil Éireann by 3 different deputies, very prominent deputies, and on each occasion, the Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment, latterly Micheál Martin.
I just want to focus on the Guards for the moment.
Well, what I'm saying is the Guards were on a hiding to nothing in 2005 because if they had accepted the logic of the internal memo that I presented them, they would then have damned the Secretary General and the Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment. So he was on a hiding to nothing.
This is Mr. Callan.
This is Martin Callan. Martin Callan initiated an internal inquiry as to the original investigation by the Guards. and he appointed...
This is the investigation of you as a...
This is an internal Garda investigation of my complaint against Mr. Butler, that Mr. Butler's allegation was vexatious, contrived and false.
What did Calnan lead you to believe?
Led me to believe, first of all, he stated that having reviewed the files, he was of the opinion that the allegation was merited.
The allegation...
No, the allegation against me.
Yeah.
So what he was now going to do, having made that statement, he then undertook, out of a sense of fairness, he said, to investigate the memo and the evidence which I contended showed that Mr. Butler was at fault.
Okay. This was years after the thing had been...
This was in This is 5 years.
It's extraordinary. He shouldn't probably have been involved in that process anyway. As the Garda Commissioner, it was strange that he'd get involved in reviewing a file that had already been dealt with, gone all the way through the process.
Correct. But I am now questioning the parliamentary... I didn't realise how important it was at the time, but effectively I was questioning the record of Dáil Éireann, which had endorsed the Garda denial.
Okay, so just finish up with then what Martin Calnan, he compromised himself in what he said to you.
Well, not at that stage. He later, when I got further evidence, damning evidence, from the chief accountant to the European Commission, namely Brian Gray, which confirmed in writing that the allegations were not only false.
This is the allegations against you.
Yes, that not only was that allegation false, but that the culpable party was the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment.
Oh.
So when I acquired that letter in January 2009, Calnan then lied by sending me two letters in quick succession, claiming that his investigation had been completed and had resulted in a second file going to the DPP, which was a complete and utter fact.
Okay, very good, very clear. So what was the role of the EU in nailing you and then exonerating you in all of this?
At the time of the parliamentary questions in 2004, the European Commission, coinciding exactly with Micheál Martin's parliamentary replies, 2 hours before Micheál Martin's parliamentary replies, the European Commission, at the level of the Director General, sent me an email telling me that I was culpable of the allegation.
And then later the EU was helpful in exonerating you?
Well, it's only helpful when I trapped the European Commission with the help of a British MEP, when I trapped him with a significant lie and let him know that some of the middle-ranking officials in the Department of Finance were briefing against him. He then came forward in a 2-page letter and, for the first time, explained that it was the department that had systemically mad.
So after years of frustration, you've got a foot in the door. There's a wedge here from the European Commission that is in some way corroborating you. So how did you attempt to ram home the truth that the allegations weren't true?
Well, I went to every politician that was available to me. I went back to the guards with the evidence.
So it might be useful then, tell me how particular politicians handled that. So let's start with Micheál Martin.
Well, in 2012, I met Micheál Martin with 2 other business people, a former chairman of ISME, Don Curry, and a director of... I just can't remember the football club he is, but a director of one of the major football clubs, Thomas Hines. At that meeting, representing Fianna Fáil, were obviously Micheál Martin as the responsible minister. And what I understood...
In the key department, the main thing here is the department, even more than the various ministers down the years, is the role of the department in damning you and then not taking responsibility and then not making any effort to exonerate you up to date.
Well, worse than that, they actually lied and lied and lied again, the department. The department actually carried out, in response to the initiative of Ruairi Quinn, 2-month investigation of the files and concluded that the allegation was justified. So it wasn't an accident. This was sustained effort to conceal the fact that the culpable...
And why did they not deal with the EU's exoneration? How did they deal with that? Why did the department not take that as gospel?
Well, the department knew what Brian Gray said was true, but they, at this stage they couldn't afford. I presume they couldn't afford to tell the truth. By virtue, first of all, it showed how exploitative they were of the democratic process of the parliamentary chamber to validate their lies. And secondly...
So there was too appalling a vista to take responsibility for the years of lies perpetrated by so many officials and so many ministers.
Correct. Secondly, it is possible that if they told the truth, because they had lied not only to me but to the European Commission, if they told the truth to the European Commission, financial threat that is recorded of minimally 400 million. Because they had systemically maladministered the European funds that they had acquired in the very sizable European funds, some 9 billion that was acquired by Ireland in 1994, because they had systemically...
Was that the Albert Reynolds?
That's the Albert Reynolds Edinburgh Summit. Phenomenal amount of money. Because they had systemically...
The European Union found that they'd systemically maladministered.
Yes, that's...
and does that enter the public domain?
That document and that finding never entered the public domain.
But you're the victim of that. Partly, people were so concerned to keep that admittedly phenomenal finding out of the public domain that you were the sacrificial lamb.
Yes, but that was one reason. But secondly, it was how they avoided that penalty that they wanted essentially to keep concealed, because they had retrospectively applied the rules that they hadn't applied. They had retrospectively applied them back to 1994. Secondly, they were concerned to avoid the resurrection of the potential penalty, significant penalty of close to £1 billion, because of the way they had avoided that penalty by lying to the European Commission and applying new audit rules from 2001 retrospective to 1994.
And those rules also affected you. Those were the rules that had resulted in the plausible claim, although untrue claim of fraud being made against you. So they were linked.
That retrospective process validated the allegation against me. And once they had done that, they couldn't draw back from it.
So the process of validating you also put the state on the hook.
Yes.
So again, it was too appalling a vista. So you're the victim. The reason that your life has been damaged so much is because you faced two appalling vistas, a department that didn't want to take responsibility for repeated lying, and a department and a country that didn't want to open up this business of a finding of maladministration. Yeah. Probably the biggest finding of maladministration in the history of the state that remains unreported.
I have a...
And why is the European Union not insisted that finding entered the public domain?
Because the European Union had been complicit with the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment up to the time that Brian Gray revealed it.
So what should the European Commission have done?
Well, logically, what they were required to do was to recoup the monies that had been maladministered.
And what have the ministers what have they done?
All training grants and infrastructure. So you had involved there the European Regional Development Fund, the European Regional Social Fund, and primarily the cohesion.
And how had they been maladministered?
I will just give you one example. This report, which has never seen the light of day, and which if you ask...
And if the mainstream media had any appetite for this stuff, they would be crawling all over, because it's such a crucial document in terms of administration of...
They should now, and they should when I originally drew their attention to it back in time. But this report says that the Irish Department of Finance overlapped in its drawing down of European funds, and that's code. The word overlap is code for double charging. So there was a significant penalty being faced by the Irish authorities for, as we've already referred to, the systemic maladministration, part of which was the overlapping.
So presumably there are people in departments and ministers who regard this as a great triumph that we avoided taking a huge penalty and a huge hit.
They have actually...
So that's one way of looking at it, that it was a triumph of politics that we avoided. But the problem is that you were the fall guy.
Yeah.
So I want you to just go back, because this is complex, but I think you've explained it well. Just again, go back to the role of Micheál Martin and a few of the most egregious ministers then, and their roles in failing to ensure that
as I say, in March 2012, after a period of communication and exchange of documents with Micheál Martin and Deirdre Galán,
who's his conciliary,
which I didn't realise at the time was of such importance. We were invited to meet Micheál in Leinster House.
Because he had put on the record statements damning you.
Yes.
And he wanted, as a decent politician, to correct the record.
That's what I understood we were doing. And when I met him, he was full of sincerity. He was angry that he had been lied to by his officials, in his own words.
And Deirdre Galán was taking minutes, reflecting his anger.
Well, first of all, he asked Deirdre Galán to confirm that he had been lied to by the official. Now, I didn't understand at the time. I was saying, why would a secretary be asked to lie? I didn't realise that she was effectively his chief of staff in the department back in 2004. It wasn't until 2 months later that
very important and well.
Absolutely. A pivotal person in the Fianna Fáil party. So, and we had discussed with him the role of Seamus Butler, the businessman, who at that stage was unaware, was connected to the Fianna, was then the Fianna Fáil leader of the Longford County Council. And at the end of that meeting, I was still unaware of his significance.
Okay, so Micheál Martin at the beginning of the meeting was well disposed towards taking responsibility for the lies of his department and his role in perpetuating those lies, but then he failed to deliver, isn't it?
Well disposed is putting it mildly. He was, according to himself, vividly angry and livid at what had happened.
And so how did this collapse then? How did it emerge that he wasn't?
Well, just to say that 6 weeks later, we were about to go to Brussels, myself and Don Curry, to discuss these matters again, and he sent Dara Cleary out to double down on his commitment. And in that process, we then learned the important...
Still on board at that stage.
Yeah. And then, some 6 months later, in about October 2012, we received a letter from Micheál Martin saying that he'd been in touch with the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, and they'd assured him that the Ombudsman had comprehensively investigated the evidence and exonerated the department and Micheál Martin. So we were shocked at that, and we approached...
Which was a strange thing to say, because he should have made his own mind up or whatever the Ombudsman on the strength of what you had said, which was definitive.
Well, not just on what I said, but on the
documentation with yourself.
Yeah. So, aware of that, we wrote back to Micheál Martin and suggested that he asked the Ombudsman to confirm it, but he would decline to do that.
So he was trying to get himself off the hook
well, he passed the buck.
Exculpating himself. He said that the Ombudsman had got him off the hook, and then he failed to back it up. And the Ombudsman then denied that.
Well, then it took 3 years to get the Ombudsman to deny that he had investigated the evidence that we had presented.
And you think that Micheál Martin perpetuated these lies and failed to act on his commitment to right them because of departmental inertia, the usual stuff about not wanting to take responsibility when you're in so deep, but also because perhaps he had the author of your downfall, the person who'd made the most aggressive allegations of fraud against you, was now a senior member of his party.
Yes, but he was getting ahead of the posse, because you had several other prominent politicians saying, including Rudy Quinn and Bertie Ahern and Brian Hayes and a number of MEPs, all saying they were endeavouring to have the Dáil record correct.
So where does it stand now with Micheál Martin?
Well, we're jumping ahead now very much, but let me for the moment just say his Dáil record continues to propagate untruths, which have done significant and continue to do significant damage to me.
Okay, and what about the role of Richard Bruton?
Well, this is what is interesting. Me having met Micheál Martin and he having said that the officials had lied to him, he then relied on those officials to exculpate him 9 months later. But that letter was signed by Richard Bruton,
who was a former minister.
So at that time, we just thought Micheál Martin Richard Bruton was a further victim of his officials. But now I realise, from what I learned subsequently, having been directed by a retired civil servant, by the way, when I was explaining my dilemma over Richard Bruton's position, he told me to go and look at who was the Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment at the time of the successful negotiation of the Edinburgh Summit. And of course, I've now realised...
So he had a dog in the fight.
Richard Bruton was the Minister in the 4 years when we commenced to systemically maladminister EU.
Okay. Tell me about the role of Leo Varadkar.
Again, we're jumping way ahead of ourselves, but if I go back to 17, the Ombudsman writes and says, no, I didn't exonerate Micheál Martin or any Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment. I didn't look at the evidence. Because of that, I then made a Data Act request to Fianna Fáil asking for the records, but I was particularly wanted the minute of the meeting where Micheál Martin had admitted and blamed his officials. We didn't get a reply from Fianna Fáil, so I had the Data Protection Commissioner directly demand that Fianna Fáil reply. That led to the peculiar designation in 2020, while he was Taoiseach, the peculiar designation by Fianna Fáil of the Taoiseach, in their words, as the Fianna Fáil data controller for the matter in question. So here you had the Taoiseach of the day being appointed by Deirdre Galán,
who is his inferior in the political spectrum.
For her minutes, she appoints the Taoiseach as the
what was the significance of that?
I can only surmise that they thought that the Data Protection Commissioner wouldn't pursue it.
Because of this, out of deference to the Taoiseach. Okay, so I'm because we're
where Leo Varadkar. So when that designation was made by Deirdre Galán, we asked the Data Protection Commissioner to ask the Taoiseach to release the minute. That took some 9 months, and of course he would have been worried that if he had released, he could have been scuppered by the department releasing the files. So it wasn't until Leo Varadkar got involved and advised that he was keeping the files closed, which, by the way, have been closed since 2004, which were closed originally by Micheál Martin. I was very aware that that disgusting had become, at one stage, distinguished, and now we seem to have reverted back to disgusting.
Yes.
In other words, the truth.
Okay. So tell us about the government inquiry.
Well, in 2014, both Ruairi Quinn and Bertie Ahern,
former leader of the Labour Party,
and at the time minister in the government,
yes,
being outraged that, having asked Richard Bruton for access to the files and being refused, both Quinn and Ahern wrote to the Taoiseach and asked that the Dáil record, as a first step, be corrected. And that led to my complaint being referred, in its totality, being referred to the Independent Review Commission.
Which is a standard process for dealing with scandals.
Well, it wasn't a standard proctor. It was an initiative of Enda Kenny as a result of the high-profile campaign run by Claire Daly. So that was an initiative comprising of 10 barristers, junior and senior, who were reviewing all cases of potential miscarriage of justice. There were 300 cases. 5 of them involved a murder or a death of some sort. Excluding those 5, of the 300 cases that were referred to the team of barristers, only mine was recommended for a statutory inquiry. And that statutory inquiry commenced in May 2017.
With very little reportage?
With no reportage. It was reported by RTE on the 9 o'clock news by Dave Murphy.
But almost nowhere else.
That inquiry commenced in May 2017. In the preliminary meetings with the judge, at one stage turned to me and said, "Mr. Mulcahy, you will be unhappy with the outcome," and turned to the State Solicitor's Office and said that you will be happy. And the reason for that is he explained that his terms of reference prohibited him from investigating
the terms of reference, again, as always, were crucial. What did the terms of reference focus on?
The terms of reference stated that he could not examine any matters that had been previously referred to the Garda Ombudsman Commission.
And what did it focus on then?
It focused on a number of minor, irrelevant issues, one of them being the fact that Martin Callinan had placed an imposition on my emails. Which
and duly then found in the last 6 months that Martin Callinan had interdicted your emails, that they could no longer be received by the Garda. But
that had lasted. Well, that was important because it prevented me from communicating.
But it didn't get to grips with the fundaments of
No, it was
just to restate the fundaments of the issue. Just what would you like that inquiry to have looked at?
The inquiry would have looked at the role of the exploitation of the parliamentary process by the civil servants to validate untruths, the consequences of which were damning for me.
And which particular untruths?
The particular untruths that I was culpable of defrauding the EU, whereas the culpable party, to a very significant extent, was both the Department of Finance and the Department.
So where does it stand now?
What it stands now is that we have written constantly in the last few months to Micheál Martin and the various Fianna Fáil deputies that he sent out to corroborate his life.
I've seen the unbelievable wide range of people that you are writing to and your attempts to get it into the media. And it's all very impressive. There are 50 different tangents and stories that merit investigation. But it seems that many people are set against it and it's going nowhere for the moment. So the purpose of this interview is to try to reignite or to ignite an issue that has been festering for 25 years and is one of the biggest scandals that affects the whole of the political process, including the state's relations with the EU.
In Ireland, as a business lobbyist, I had quickly formed the opinion that I could go into a department and meet senior officials and win every debate with those officials and not get anywhere unless they read it in the papers. The role of the fourth estate is critical to establishing the facts.
And your case illustrates that. Just very briefly then, tell me about the respective role of the media, and maybe tell me about the roles of the Irish Times, Irish Independent and RTE.
Well, the best thing I can do there is to say that Minister Quinn was of the opinion that we should involve the press in this affair.
When was that?
This was when we met him. The best way I can address that is to say that we were encouraged by the Minister for Education, Ruairi Quinn, to involve the press because he, as minister, as a serving minister, was at the loggerheads with his fellow cabinet, Richard Bruton, who was refusing the Minister for Education access to the files that were the responsibility.
Okay, so you went to the press. Who did you go to?
I've been to the press on numerous occasions, but...
Tell me about your treatment in RTE.
Well, we spent some 9 months in researching and putting together a file which I understood that RTE were going to do a programme on, primarily because Minister had...
Put his name to it.
Not only that, but he had gone and met the senior officials in RTE with a view to putting a programme where he would have explained how he was in loggerheads.
When was this?
This was in 2014.
What happened to the programme?
I was told that RTE decided that I would have a panic attack in the process and that in any event the programme would cost him $250,000 to put together. And on that basis...
And who told you that?
Members of Ruairi Quinn's inner cabinet.
Okay.
Who were party to those negotiations.
And anything else? Any other treatment?
Well, RTE in 2007 had undertaken to run a programme, had initiated contact with the Department of the Taoiseach, and asked the Department of the Taoiseach, in the name of Michael Sludds, who was one of the Taoiseach spokespersons, had asked him, was there any truth in what I said about retrospective audit process and the systemic maladministration of European funds?
Which programme was that? Okay, and what about the Irish Times?
Irish Times, again, I had provided the Irish Times senior journalists, particularly Colm Keena, with hard evidence of wrongdoing by the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, of audits being changed.
When was that?
I provided that evidence to him in 2012, 2013.
And did he lead you to believe that the Irish Times would do a splash on it?
Well, absolutely, because one of his colleagues had asked to run the story, and I said, no, Colm is doing it, let Colm run the story. But that never appeared. But subsequently, Ruairi Quinn rang in, and they had a discussion about the culpability of the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. This was explicit, tangible evidence that was being provided to the Irish Times by a government minister, a leader of the Labour Party. And yet that story was buried. Never saw the light of day.
And was there any explanation given? And the Irish Independent?
Irish Independent, well, they have declined to engage with me for several years. Initially, they had been very supportive of me back when the charges were made by Mr. Butler. But once the report was made to the DP...
So why do you think the media are blacking you, and what do you make of the media generally?
Well, I am absolutely in a quandary as regards why the extraordinary evidence, which just, by the way, the change to the systemic maladministration. I was the only one that was reported that the DPP had lost his job. But the other people were affected. Other recipients of state aid were allowed to take the blame. Now, in my case, it was particularly damaging. Other people suffered. The Chambers Ireland was accused of maladministering European funds. The CEO there was compelled to resign. He got employment elsewhere. Rehab were egregiously dragged through the court, squealing that they didn't know why they were being dragged through the European court. By the way, the senior counsel at that stage was Paul Gallagher, who is currently the Attorney General. When he was the Attorney General...
And why have we not heard, why have the press not covered the positions of Rehab?
Well, Rehab issued a statement when they were judged to be culpable by the European courts. And they said they expressed their quandary as to how they could be culpable when the department said they did everything.
Same position.
And nobody took it up.
Okay, so just then finally, where do you see this thing going?
Well, I'm going nowhere, except I'm going to continue to prosecute this to my best effect. People say, why didn't you initiate legal proceedings? Well, on the one hand, in 2010, when Rory Quinn got involved in a very detailed way, he made a commitment that if I swore the legal route, he would have the department issue a meaningful apology and make compensation for the damage that was done to me. Now, he tried, and I don't decry he tried his best, but the officials got the better of it.
Okay.
Then the statute of limitation ran out. And, of course, I haven't worked in 20 years, so I was effectively skint. I didn't have the money. And I haven't found a lawyer yet who is prepared to offer a pro bono to me.
Okay, Frank, thank you very much. Proving that not all heroes wear capes. One of the biggest scandals that has had the most dramatically surprising small amount of attention from the media, a scandal that's now been going on for 25 years, and let's hope that the political process finally gets to grips with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.